Hello, everyone. Wayne Hunter here again and doing another webinar session. And I've got with me today Mr. Mark Sangster, Chief of Strategy with Adlumin. We are, and hopefully, Mark, we'll have a lot of fun with this and the following two webinars when we go
Absolutely.
through this whole thing with everybody. I know there's quite a few people who have signed up for this, and we're going to jump in to see what kind of education we can give today. And that's going to be the focus, education about the market today. So as part of this, as you'll see here, I wanted to remind everybody that this is a three-part series. We're going to talk about the evolving state of cybersecurity landscape today. And then next Thursday, we will talk about the requirements that your business must meet to deal with what's going on the cyber landscape. Depending on your business, what are the key things you need to be making sure that you meet? And then our final one, we're going to actually show you some technology and how Mark and I go to market to actually help our customers in dealing with all these requirements are going on that seems to be evolving every minute of every day. Mark, wouldn't you agree?
Um, Absolutely, right? I mean, I think that's the one thing we can say about cybersecurity is that it's never static, and the only constant is change.
That is the only well, it's fitting for IT, right? It's always changing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the sort of hardest things for people to grapple is that there is no set and forget, right? Or fire and forget. You can't just set up a system and say, okay, so I passed a vulnerability assessment today and everything's great because then employees come and go. You bring in new technology, right? Bad guys come up with new tools and techniques. Exploits, vulnerabilities come out from the big major vendors that you're using, and we see that all the time, right? SolarWinds, Microsoft, Kaseya, et cetera. And that's the problem, right? It's like the shifting sands in a desert, right? What you saw at night is not going to look like what it is in the morning.
Absolutely. So one of the things when we talk about landscape, in this slide here, you know, there is a lot of components to the landscape. It's not just your internal IT infrastructure. There's many more things you have to take a look at to be able to determine what's going on in the world today when it comes to crime. Because in world, it's not only what you're doing in-house, but because of work from home, all the remote, that opens up way more things you have to be concerned with, but also how we do business with vendors today. And we're bringing those networks and things into play. So our landscape has exploded. And so when you think about these things, what is it that you guys look at Adlumin that's really what you try to educate the folks on how to determine what your landscape is?
Yeah, so Adlumin, the name kind of comes from to add light, right? And if I use a light analogy here, the more you open the aperture, the more light you're going to let in, and potentially the more you can see. Of course, the challenge there is often you're overwhelmed by that level of light, right? It becomes harder to focus. And what you're talking about, I think, is really critical because everyone takes a myopic kind of view, right? They look at what tools and technologies they use, and they think that they can have to some degree absolute control over them, but they're not thinking about partners. And I don't even mean vendors. I mean, you can work with other partners in your ecosystem and you're sharing files, technical drawings, legal documents, whatever it might be, and you don't know how secure they are. You don't know what vulnerabilities, exposures they have. And then there's the stuff out in the wild, right? There's the credentials that have been compromised, documents that have been stolen. And I think this is one people don't think about the publicly available stuff. So think about, you mentioned COVID and work from home, and we had the war in Ukraine, and that kind of got everybody flustered around what was going to happen on the the cybercrime sort of side of it with the Russians. And so you've got all these other big tectonic kind of events, right, or geopolitical events that are out there that we have zero control over. But all of that can come together into what you see here. And my point in when we talk about this, when I work with customers and I show them this slide, I want to tell them a few things. The first is it's not they push a magic button and suddenly you're shut down with ransomware. They use it, they use stolen credentials. They use your own tools. They try to get in through your VPN and your remote access or remote administration tools, whatever you have, right? Whether that's RDP or using PowerShell or a third party, whatever it might be. And they're slowly moving through your environment quietly before they get to that end game, right? And so it's a good news, bad news story. And the reason I say it's let's start with the bad news, right? The reality is it's complex and it's sophisticated, right? So,
Right.
that nobody wants to go up against a sophisticated adversary. But the reality is, and this is why I think it's a good news story, is that it means there's lots of different times, right? Lots of things they touch, fingerprints they leave, motion sensors they're going to trip, getting caught on CCTV footage, things like that, that give you that opportunity in the early stages in that white band or maybe even to that kind of gray band to catch them before it becomes a business disrupting event. And all too often I see as businesses, they're like, oh, well, business was great on Friday and on Monday we were shut down. It's like, that's simply not true. There were a lot of signs and symptoms. And if you don't believe me, ask the companies that have been hit because that incident response firm they bring in, the insurer brings in to look at what happened, they're going to find all this stuff. They're going to see this breadcrumb trail, and you're going to realize this was not a single factor. This wasn't the failure of a co-op or an intern or one system being improperly configured or somebody not following policy. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Well, the interesting part of that theory is it kind of leaves we're bleeding over the edge of requirements. But what's a key point, which we'll delve into in the next webinar next week. But that's one of the things I find when talking to customers that's been hit, because you glean so much about what you need to do to improve your cyber framework to deal within the
Right.
landscape. And one of the
Yep.
things is a lot of customers I talk to will go off and they say, hey, well, we did an assessment. We do assessment, once a year. We do that. Or
Hmm.
I know some are doing it once a quarter. But even some of the
Yep.
ones that are doing it once a quarter, they still got hit.
Oh
And
yeah.
now what they're realizing is this isn't something you do once, update your documentation, hey, I'm good, because there's things changing in your environment every day. I mean,
Yeah.
how often do you add a user count? How often, one of the admins are doing something, installing a piece of software. So now it's kind of like the way back in the day when you first doing networking and you started doing microsegmentation, it was something you had to monitor all the time to make sure it was in place correctly. Well, now that's part of the landscape now is continuously monitoring to whatever those frameworks are that you've got to support from a business
Yeah.
standpoint, but just from a hacking standpoint, it's got to be proactive and looking at it around the clock every day. And that's one of those things is now you have to build that into your landscape that you're protecting.
Mhm.
Yep. So
Yeah.
money, and it's part of that whole landscape. And we're talking about ours, but just think about cybercrime and how they've industrialized what they've done. They've built their own landscape to go against us.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I kind of jokingly call them the Misfortune 500, and the reason I
Misfortune.
say that is is
I'm
is that
gonna
they
use that. I like that.
there you go. There you go. That's right. That's the freebie for today, everybody. Is the look? They operate like large businesses, right? They have an executive structure. They have
Yep.
compensation models. They have training. These aren't kids in a hoodie in mom's basement, right? And I think people think of them as amateurs, and they've operated in all sorts of other criminal areas like human trafficking and weapons, illegal weapon, like military grade sales and these kind of things. Like you have to understand drugs, you have to understand who they are. And ransomware as a service became a pretty popular thing a few years ago where if you think about it like a tech firm, right? They build their technology and another way to go to market, just like we would use channels as an example, they're doing the same. So some smaller gang can buy, rent, lease, or profit share a bigger gang like a Conti or Black Bastard. Now Conti's gone, their tech, and then like I said, they revenue profit share off of the stolen the money that they can capture, or they pay a licensing fee, whatever. And they've become really good at going after supply chain exploits like you were talking about earlier with Kaseya as an example. Systemic vulnerabilities, these ones keep popping up, right? And they're not going to go away. We work with complex technology. It's like our cars, right? Our cars get more and more complex, and the concept of, even though if you change the oil regularly and do that kind of basic maintenance, things can still go wrong. And I think the biggest, shockers to some and validators to others was the kind of the sophistry, the trickery that these gangs were doing. And that came out at the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict, where, half of Conti, which was kind of the prominent criminal gang at the time,
Yep.
half of them were Russian and said, yeah, we're supporting Mother Russia. And the other half are Ukrainian. And they're all saying, like, heck, we are. And that civil war and communications showed us a bunch of stuff. And I think the big eye opener was the fact that they were setting up shell companies, going out to security vendors and testing them, like pretending that they're a company, a bank in Germany, and that they're looking at endpoint or something, and they want to test this stuff out, and they put them through the ringer. They work with their technical teams to understand how the system works, and of course they're doing it so they can figure out where the gaps are, how to reverse engineer it, how do they evade the detection capabilities of these tools. So these guys are really clever, and there's an entire, like you said, there's an entire ecosystem around them of buy, sell, trade expertise in tech.
Well, that's kind of things we was talking about. Talk about the fake companies, and in that, if we look at Hacker News, and it was coming out, and it was in the next slide, is that you talk about Conti, and their Conti's in there, and
Yeah,
in that piece, when you start looking at it, the interesting part is where we in our environment as a vendor take care of a customer, we're always evaluating technology.
hmm,
Well, these same hacker companies are doing the exact thing. They create a fake company, like you was talking about, and to look
yeah,
like a legitimate MSP or a legitimate VAR, and they get in and they test for the purpose of doing reverse engineering on them to go
yeah,
and hack. So that's where, when you start looking at, and it really come in the environment and looking at, when I look at a vendor now, is how are they doing their updates? How are they doing
yeah,
their security for their own company? Those are things, instead of just evaluating the product itself, I'm evaluating what they're doing as a company now. What are their policies and procedure for cybersecurity? How are they going to do their patch management? Are they doing patches once a year? Are they outputting them ongoing? Are they linking into the OSs they support? Those
hmm.
type of things, because that ecosystem, their landscape of what they're working on, I got to make sure it's staying ahead of the guys that's trying to reverse engineer. And that's
Yeah,
basically what
and
we're talking about, right?
yeah, exactly. And I don't want to jump too far ahead because I think we got a slide covering this. But LastPass has had everyone hopping, right? Because you got a password vault company that was hacked, multiple occasions, and we saw different announcements come from them around the significance, the impact, what was affected, and it started off with, oh, it's just a minor thing, right up to hey, guess what? It turns out they have your master password, and they they have everything right on the dev side, and that's and so you're right, like we do have to trust but verify, right? I think you do have to work with those vendors and understand how they work, dig into their policies, look at what controls they're putting in place, because you can be super safe, but at the end of the day, if they have an access grant into your environment or into your ecosystem, unfortunately, whatever vulnerability and exposures they bring is now introduced to you, and frankly, you're responsible for them.
All right. So if we lead into, like, because I know we got a slide, I think it's not this one, but the next one, but this really leads into when I talk about folks is, if you're the landscape piece of this, when we talk about understanding your business, is understand, to me, it's about communication.
Mhm.
I told my cousin's a DJ, and then I was doing a radio spot with him on cybersecurity,
Yeah,
and he was like, "Well, how do you know when people are masquerading?" I said, "Well, understand how you communicate with them." I said, "Gary, when I call you, do I say, 'Hey, Gary?'" He goes, "No, you say, 'Hey, cuz.'" I was like, "Exactly." I
bingo.
said,
Yeah,
"If they're calling and they're saying they're me and they don't say, 'Hey, cuz,' do you think they're me?" He's like, "Of course not." I said, "It's as simple as that, but it's hard to go do it. So you got to understand how you establish, what is that line of communicating? How do you communicate? It's typically like when you say, your grandmother calls and say, Microsoft calls, says, "I need to give my credit card to help because I got a problem on this." Well, you have to understand that business, that's not how they do business. They
that's
don't
right.
call you and say, "Hey, give me your credit card to do this." You're lucky if you get Microsoft to do support for you to start with. But you got to understand how you're doing these things and understand how your business communicates with them so they know you're legitimate as well. And I find that's out there, that's where it's, as we call it, the phishing attack,
Mhm.
right? That's what 90% of all attacks come in through a phishing
Yeah,
environment,
absolutely.
and that's communication.
Yeah, 100%. And I think so. You've touched on a couple of things here. One is expected behaviors, expected outcomes. As you said,
Mhm.
how do we greet each other, right? How do businesses conduct or companies conduct their business, right? And so I think some of that creates almost a sort of a soft layer that should help your intuition figure out whether something is legit or not. But the other piece, if I go back to it, I just said it, right, is, trust but verify. So, a lot of times these controls are in place for a reason. So, a good example, we saw this in financial services, 10 years ago, fake redemptions, as in, I don't know, there's a hurricane hits somewhere and some wealthy individual calls up and says, look, take, $100,000 out of my whatever, investment portfolio and send that to the Red Cross. And people were just doing it. And we
Mhm.
actually saw, in fact, one of the big brokers on Wall Street who actually makes a lot of those transactions happen for many, hedge funds and private equity firms and investment firms and so on, was doing it without getting validation. And in fact, if you looked at some of the emails, they were staggering because they had those early markers of a phishing attack, right?
Right.
Poor grammar and spelling and the greetings. Somebody doesn't say, uh, Wayne, your weekend should be good, I hope for you. And, by the way, can you take, sum of money and put in this account? And you're looking at that going, does Mark talk like that? Does he write like that? No. And think Mark probably wants me to call him and say, it's Wayne. I just want to know if you really want that money to go to the Red Cross, right? And I'm probably going to be like, what are you talking about? And we see a lot of that. And that's sort of how it started. And what I think is important, right, is looking for those contextual flags that tell you whether or not it's sincere or authentic. But then the other piece is also even just stepping back and thinking about like the business part. So, one of the screens there, if you see the email, it says forwarded message. That targeted law firms a few years ago, and basically it faked that there was a complaint made against the lawyer, and there was a PDF attached, and it basically said, you got 10 days to respond to this complaint, otherwise, you're in trouble. And the PDF was legit. It had been taken, probably from a court proceeding or a bar association, and been stolen, and just the names changed to protect the innocent. And yet, look at all the triggers in that. If you look at it, like it comes from the state attorney, which is incorrect. It comes from an Outlook.com address, not a
Mhm.
.gov address. Those are the
Yep.
obvious ones. But now let's stop. You can't be summoned or served this way. So,
Yep.
like, as a lawyer, you should have been like, man, this is not how this works. Check the bar, right? All that stuff is public, right? You can go in and say, like, hey, did somebody file this complaint? And they didn't. And in fact, I think it was like 300 lawyers were affected across, a large, 50 law firms, I think in, New York and Florida and New Jersey and so on. And so it's like, just step back to business 101. What do you expect to have happen? How do things transact? Because that is going to wipe out a lot of this stuff. Then the more clever ones, like we're going to talk about in the next slide,
Yeah,
they're a little
exactly.
harder. You got to
Yep.
pay attention, right?
Mhm.
So these ones are all fake. And I didn't want to recover, but if you look at the one on the left, that was one where they posed an email where they posed as a professional student in a graduate program. So think lawyer, doctor, accountant, right? And they were looking for a mentor, and they went back and forth with their targets for about 2 weeks. And it was legit transactions, right? Like, hey, I want to be I want to be a corporate lawyer, or I want to do criminal law, or I want to be a doctor, and I want to practice, orthopedics, something along those lines. And then after that 2 week period, they sent them this email thanking them so much for it with a link to a Amazon stored doc that basically said, "Hey, can you complete the survey so that I get academic credit?" Genius, right? Also fake. Um, I've seen letters of complaint where they pretend that there's a lawsuit against the company, and they even set up the fake website that looks like the file share, the safe room that would
Mhm.
be normal. And but of course, when you go back, there's nothing there. You should, if you check with the lawyers at this law firm, it's a legit law firm. Lawyers aren't involved in this; they don't even know who you are. Fake Microsoft logins. We've seen this, right? They pop this up and, it says, hey, we've gone from, Exchange on-prem to Office 365. You got to relog in, authenticate again to get it to work. And of course, they were capturing that. And then the other thing we've seen too is SEO attacks. So this is bad guys Googling, hey, what do executives search for? I don't know, pay scales, templates, tools, calculators, all those kind of things. Well, then they steal those docs or they create them and they weaponize them. And so you do the search, you end up going to their site. And the lesson here is probably the most expensive things in the world are free, right?
Right.
So when you see everybody else charging you $100 for that report and it's free somewhere else, be wary. But again, I want people to understand the complexity and the subtlety of these things. They are very good, but there are always indicators and triggers. And if you just take a breath, tactical pause, and you validate it, you're going to find out a lot of this stuff is fake.
Well, I'm going to ask before we go to the next year. Now, everybody's
Mhm.
watching. If you got any questions, just pop them into the chat. We'll roll them right into this. We don't have to wait to the end. We'd rather have you ask the questions and we answer it right when something's relevant. So we like folks to be involved. So join in best you can, and we'll keep moving forward here. So when we're talking about these things here, then earlier when we talked about the landscape, we started talking about, it's not just the internal, it's not just the employees working remote, but how we do business. You mentioned like partners we do business as well as vendors we're doing business.
Mhm.
And we got systems that we use between us that has a level of trust, right? Or
That's
should
right.
have a level of trust. We tend to get lackadaisical and validating that trust on an ongoing process because, hey, we got it set up, it's ready to go. But those can be infiltrated and then gather information from us as well. So it can't be just that one side you look at. I think here you're trying to give some examples of that trust system being broke.
Yeah, exactly. And, again, if we go back to Miss Fortune 500 for a second, if you think about what is profit, profit is the difference, it's your revenue minus your operating
Mhm.
costs. So if you think about it from a criminal perspective, the reason they're going after these systems, right? The obvious one, of course, is the access to downstream victims, right? Everybody uses Microsoft. So if you can, exploit a vulnerability in exchange, you've got a big customer base to go after. But you can't opt out of that risk because at the end of the day, modern business requires you to be able to communicate, to transfer documents, and so on. And to do that, you're going to have to use basic systems. And you might not like the one with the red logo. Well, you go pick the one with the blue logo, but they're all going to have the same amount of problems, right? The same amount of risk. And by going after these kind of companies too, they give an idea that anything is wrong. And if they get past that, then it's open days. Whereas, with a 0 day, if they were to spread that across hundreds of companies, well, there's hundreds of companies that now have that opportunity to detect it. So if you think about it, right, you got 100% of the market you can go after. You can reduce your operational costs by coming up with, streamlined, quick to market 0 days that work. And then once you do that, you're off to the races. And if you look at, I want to show you how easy this is. That Shodan report that's there,
Mhm.
that's an open tool that anybody can use. So I can literally go, okay, I have a vulnerability in Kaseya version, 1234. So show me all the internet facing Kaseya servers out there. Show me all the ones that are running that version. And you're literally getting that heat map like you see in that screen with all the connection information. So now I can write a script that goes, go ping all those IPs and try this. And if I can connect to those servers, we're off to the races. So it's a lot easier than you think, right? To some degree, it's almost like Googling victims, right? Show me everybody who's got this, and away we go. And I'm going to run my script, and I'm going to go get lunch, right, and wait for the results.
Just real quick for everybody listening, we're not trying to scare the out of you. We're just trying to educate you on what's going on here. But this is what it's like out there, and the tools they have. Same tools
Mhm.
we go in and look and assess and try to make sure we find the holes in environments to help shore them up to protect ourselves. A lot of times it's some of the same tools that the hackers are using. So that's what makes it extremely hard in going in and protecting yourself and understanding. But there's ways to go about doing that. And I think that leads us into when we start about these trust factors and you look at LastPass, like we was talking about, and you wanted to get
Mhm.
into, is that's a situation where you've got not only businesses but just individuals, because LastPass supports both business and end of a personal users and stuff like this. And that's one of those where you have a trust of a vendor and you're doing these things to go and do that. But now you're also have to be aware of what are they doing to protect themselves, to protect our data and go into that. And that, the individual users, I can see where they may not go to that because they don't know. They're just trying to protect their, password to their PC games or to,
Yeah.
the Roku TV or whatever, where, we're using vendors like us will use it to protect sensitive passwords to service accounts, to admin accounts, to you name it, applications, whatever it may be. So from a business standpoint, that's where we got to do due diligence on ourselves for our business to understand what they're doing and see what goes on. Now, that's not to say that there's a perfect bullet. There's no such thing out here. And this, it's an ongoing war. It evolves what's going on there. And you always got to be getting better, always being due diligent about what you're doing, because there's always a code problem or something like that that can open things up. And I think that's kind of where we got into with LastPass, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a couple of factors here. The first one was that they were going after, developer accounts with
Right.
administrative access. So we see that shift, right? They're not just trying to go after the financial clerk or the payroll clerk. They do that for other reasons. And this is kind of poisoning the well. And it's the same thing we saw with SolarWinds, the same thing we saw with
Right.
Kaseya. But I
Exactly.
think here where it also kind of went more off the rails was the trust just got eroded because like I said, there's sort of three big delivery, I guess, of communication publicly. And the first went from like it's nothing to the second one went to, well, okay, it's kind of serious, but you're fine, to the third, which is like, yeah, it's serious and you're not fine. And that has really killed trust. And
Right.
I've seen a lot of companies are moving off of LastPass and they're going to one password. And the problem with that is, I don't blame them. I understand the response, and I can see if you've got to justify to your exec, your CEO is sitting there going, you just told me LastPass is better than, it's the lesser of the two evils, and now I'm finding out that we just effectively stepped on the landmine voluntarily. I want them out. I understand that motivation, but I think the timing, frankly, it couldn't be worse because you'll see it on the next slide too. But a lot of companies, I was seeing a trend now. We're moving towards a democratization of password or of some tools. So, as in, if you have specific employees and you're using LastPass or you're using one password or some other vault, that they were then buying licenses, extending licenses for their families, because of course they also know that a senior exec, as an example, or a critical employee can be targeted through personal emails, through their accounts, and so they kind of wanted to aggregate all of
Hmm.
this under this one sort of protective umbrella. And I think that's just, I'm sure that's come to a grinding halt. And now we're seeing undoing. In fact, I was watching one bulletin that I watch in the legal space, and they're all talking about how to shift because, of course, the senior partners are all losing their minds and want off of it. But interestingly, and to counter this, I met with and spoke to the CISO from SolarWinds last week. And when I talked to him about what went on, he was the exact opposite. He's actually, since that has occurred, been on kind of like a tour, going out talking about this is what happened, and not just what happened, but how it was handled and what they did right and what they could have done better, and how they would do it differently now and what they've put in place, not as just a mea culpa, or saying, yeah, we screwed up,
Hmm.
we're really sorry, but also it was to share, right? It was to help other companies not
Right.
end up in the same position. And so I actually, if I compare the two, I have to commend SolarWinds for taking that view of like, look, we're going to talk about what happened and be honest about it, versus this constant fear of the press, fear of public backlash, and hiding things. And I call it the deferral of pain. You're just kicking the can down the road towards the inevitable, and eventually you pay the price.
Yeah, the longer you kick it down the road, the more trust you lose, like you said. Because there's been
Exactly.
many,
Yeah.
there's lots of vendors that have been hacked, but what they did was as soon as it happened, they reported it because that's the number one thing from the FBI's perspective is reporting. It's a law, and you have to report it. Now, of course, what they'll look at is, well, I'm going to lose face in the public media.
Hmm.
It's going to hurt my business. But what we have found, and actually the FBI has reported on this, is those that had reported as soon as it happened, their business wasn't affected like it was the ones that tried
Yeah.
to defer it
Yeah. Yeah.
and go do that. They kept their trust because people understand is, hey, there are, this is a tough business and all this, and you come out and what you're doing and what the issue was and how we're dealing with it, we're finding that they're getting trust because the ones that's getting hacked, and as long as they kind of they're reporting it, what we're finding is they're actually doing things and they're showing up even tighter and improving their policies and procedures to where
Yeah.
now they're way beyond those that haven't been hit.
Yeah, in fact, I often talk about this. You know, we learn more from our mistakes than our successes, right? And in fact,
Right.
I like to quote a fictitious character from a movie who said, you know, only from disaster can we be resurrected, right? And if that was Tyler Durden from Fight Club, and yes,
Yeah.
he's a fictitious character, but you know, there's a lesson in that. And if you compare what you're talking about, Wayne, to like Travelex, for example, that 2 years ago, a big, you know, one of
Yes.
the world's largest currency exchange companies folded after they, you know, effectively deceived the public for months about, you know, calling a massive ransomware shutdown scheduled maintenance. And you know, they just continued to lie about it. Of course, you know, they're still going through the ringer. They're headquartered in the EU, or were, so they're still going through the ringer with, you know, privacy investigations and data breach investigations under GDPR and so on. So you're right, the faster you come to it. And you know, another message here is companies, you got to be prepared. You have to work with experts who know how to prepare you for these things so that you can tell your story and establish the narrative, and you know, frankly, do the right thing versus, you know, like I said, just trying to defer it and hoping it will go away, because it's not going to go away. It's only going to get worse.
I agree with that. And it just kind of leads into, you know, when we look at folks in these attack frames here, and I always heard, we don't, I got a Mac because I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
But what's what's more scary about this here is, well, Chrome, so many apps are written, if you don't use Chrome, they don't work, right?
Hmm.
So that's kind of, you're targeted into there. Um, the Safari, I mean, you look at just the iPhone, right? And that's the part that I scrutinize more than anything else, is the mobile devices,
Yeah.
because of protecting yourself at the mobile device area, but they have access to corporate wireless. They have access to all these
Correct.
different things. And that probably concerns me more than the firewall, or some of the ways I allow people to come in, because I know that. I know how that gets attacked, and I can prepare that. I don't know where that phone's going to be. And I didn't have
Uh,
enough to do it. Now the tools are better today that allows me to do that, and also see real time if something's happening, so I can block that, put it out, come into that. But key part about education day is, you got to understand, is that phone in that employee's hand, or my employee's kid's hand, or
mhm.
somebody else, is still part of your network. That's part of your
Yeah, that's
landscape.
That's right, and it's nomadic, right? It travels around, like
Right.
you said. You
Yeah.
know, people like you and I, right? We're on the road all the time. We're in hotels, we're in airports, and these are great opportunities for, you know, for criminals to collect, right? To you know, set up fake networks that your iPhone or whatever automatically connects to, because it's a, you know, it's a network, you know. And a lot of people trust credential
Exactly.
vaulting in these browsers, and you know, the reality is it isn't as good as using a independent password vault. So, you know, when you got your credit card in there, like with Google Pay, and it's, you know, and I'm not picking on any one vendor, right? Because it's across the
Oh,
board, right? It's
that's
Android,
across
it's
the board.
Apple,
Yeah, you name it,
and you know,
across the
so
board.
you know, yeah, and but there's a risk there, right? And I think that's the, you know, I think some of the FICO 2 standards are good, like getting better at the way the encrypt and using public and private keys, and coming up with better ways to do this. But these are here, right? And you know, ironically, and I'm not going to name them, but you know, the sort of the it might actually be now that one of the safest browsers may be the browser that comes with most operating systems. That's the one that you use to get the browser you want to use, that you like, just because it's not used. The reality is, right? And
That's
again,
good point. I like that.
eh,
That's a good
you
point.
know,
Uh,
and unfortunately, you know, criminals go to watering holes, right? So they know, okay, if everyone's using Safari, everyone's using Chrome, or whatever they're using, Opera, or take your pick, Firefox, then that's what they're going to do, right? So, you know, unfortunately, they know where the animals come at dusk to get a drink, and they wait, right? So, you know, this is sort of part of life. Unfortunately, we have to deal with.
Well, one of the things that I think about this is, because depending on what your business is, whether you're, you know, in energy, or whether you're in finance, or whether you come into this, one of the things you got to be aware of, because now these devices are, you know, so integrated. And if you got bring your own device, and you're doing this,
Yeah,
now you probably really need to pay attention to, just across the board for everybody, cybersecurity insurance. Because when you talked about the passwords in the browsers,
yeah,
underwriters are now asking you to report how many records of PII information are contained in your browser cache. Think
yeah.
about that. And
Oh
that's
yeah.
not an easy thing to find. Now, the thing
Mm-mm.
about it is the browser cache is one of the easiest places for hackers to hack to get
Right.
in. And it's
That's
just
right.
amazing. I cringe every time I see somebody save their password there. It's not
Exactly.
allowed in my company. It's absolutely not allowed. I tell all my customers, do not do that.
Yep.
If we can, we'll disable that where you can't,
Yep.
because it's a very bad thing to do out there.
Yeah, and and turning on any form of two-factor authentication,
Yes.
whatever you got, right? And pretty much they all do it, right? Like, the iOS and Android operating systems will do that. You know, uh, Amazon and all the major retailers, and I say to people like, turn that stuff on. Yes, you're gonna have to wait for another code if you're using PayPal or whatever it is, but like you want to do that because you are reducing the risk, right? Because you're right. If they get into your cache, they've got your username and your password. They've got, they understand what you're buying. And there's the immediate risk, which is that, okay, I've got creds that I might be able to use. And then this sort of the longer risk is social engineering. I know what you buy, I know what you like. I saw you just
Yep.
spent a bunch of money on something, and hey, I'm going to send you a deal on that. And you're likely, or I know you've been looking at buying something, and
Exactly.
so I'm going to send you some deal, and that's a great way to get you to click and go to where I want you to go.
We'll actually talk about that more in the next webinar on requirements, because there is a lot of requirements coming out around 2FA,
Hmm.
browsing, and a lot of stuff like that. So what we and come into that now, email compromises, obviously, the phishing attacks, like we've been saying, coming in there. So how your email system set up, a lot of people saying that, I've got an on-prem exchange. I don't want to go to Office 365 because
Hmm.
security. Well, the same security you're applying to your internal exchange is some of the same security you apply to 365, because all 365 is hosted exchange. That's all it
Yeah.
is.
Yep.
Okay, with a more than complicated browser interface to it. But
That's right.
those are things. It's part of that landscape. Now we talk, the cloud pieces being part of your landscape, making sure that you got a framework that ties into that to do the same protections as you would do with it sitting inside. And it can be done. We do it every day.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
there's some places where we feel that we got better security on our 365 clients than we got on our exchange clients,
I would agree.
because exchange patching and things what have it,
Yeah.
how long people keep exchange, but not do the UC update rollups and things of that
Hmm.
nature. So don't be afraid of having the cloud part of your landscape, because there's a lot of security that's put around that helps.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because a lot of the sort of back end updating and so on then is done around that. And if we think about cloud, the big vulnerabilities there for me are things like misconfigurations
Yep.
and compromised accounts, right? And that's the obvious stuff. But if you're running Exchange on prem, you've got a lot more work, I would say, there. That's your responsibility to keep it updated. And frankly, kind of everyone's going this route, and it makes sense. And even in this example, okay, so you see this, business email compromise, and they were able to get into the CFO's Office 365 account. Well, the way they got in was no different than they would have on prem, right? They fished them, they got their creds, like that's it, right? So
Exactly.
but once they were in, what I love about this one, when you look at it, is everybody thinks of them as being unsystematic and opportunistic. And, this person got, 11 million bucks. And it's because they were smart enough to, compromise the CFO's account. They set up folders with redirects. So, when they sent out something saying, hey, pay this invoice, whatever came back that the CFO might read, they were automatically having, they were intercepting those messages and dumping them in a folder, way down at the bottom of their inbox. So they never saw it. And it was kind of a smart tactic. But again, when I look at these kind of things, this is back to like, and I know we're going to talk about this in the
Mhm.
second webinar of the series, is a lot of this stuff is about procedures and requirements, and
Exactly.
two signatures. And I worked with one manufacturing firm that got duped out of I can't remember now. I think it was like 1.6 million in fake invoicing, and in one of them, a clerk in a satellite office, bottom end pay scale individual was able to transfer 650,000 over a wire service. And even the wire transfer service, the bank came back and went, this looks wonky. Like, this isn't right. Are you sure? And she said, yes, and did it. And when I came in, I'm standing there in the boardroom and the CEO's like, wow, we're going to fire this person and we're going to do this. And I'm looking at him going like, I hate to say this, man, if there's one person I might be terminating here, it might be your CFO. Because how can a entry level individual have access and power to do that? Like to pay a $650,000 invoice without even getting a second signature? Like that doesn't sound like fiduciary care to me in any way.
Mhm. We talked about the phishing and pieces of that, but it's not restricted to the internal employees only that we're driving into. So, the Russian accent, as we go
Hmm.
to the next slide here. And you got an example about QuickBooks and coming into this, but it's a spouse of a managing partner.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this story I like to
There's other
tell
things
because
happening there, right, Mark?
oh yeah, lots of things happening. But I think what's elegant about this one, and again, when I talked about extending your sort of your umbrella of protection into some of your family, was
Uh-huh.
in this case, this was a hedge fund in New York, and the spouse of one of the partners was buying artwork for the new office. And if you've ever been to a hedge fund, these are people who come in with six, at least high six, not seven, figure kind of investments, right? So
Mhm.
wealthy people. And it's generally filled with the real art. You and I might have the poster from IKEA. Well, they actually have the original. And so she's buying all this artwork, and she got duped by some criminals who got into her Gmail account, and then they saw this transactions going back and forth, and went, okay, we can steal some money or get iTunes gift cards, but like there's a bigger win to be had here, right? And they were literally intercepting emails, they were deleting the originals, sending fake ones, and they did all the basic stuff, set up a fake domain that looked like it was the art dealers, were sending the invoices with the photographs because she was also talking about it on Facebook, so they knew what she was buying. And in the end, they paid out the fund, I should say, paid out about 400,000 in fake invoices until the real invoices appeared. And of course, you can imagine the shock and panic in the finance department when suddenly they're like, "No, what are you talking about? We paid that bill," and then realizing like, "No, you haven't." And then they did the reverse math, and that was kind of in the early days of this, and they weren't able to recover any of it. But lessons here is back to what you talk about in social media, what you talk about in the public, even if it's your personal life, can have an impact on your professional life. And another quick example I had was an individual who was a senior executive in a well-known brand manufacturer, who decided to take a stand on a political issue, and shortly after that their business was attacked with ransomware. And the forensics showed us that they were only going after that company. So it wasn't, this wasn't, they didn't get hit in a broad attack or phishing attempt. This was retaliatory. And so I'm not telling you what your political alignment or your values or viewpoints should be. My point is you really have to think carefully about what you do, what you say, and what you present, because there's just no point putting a bullseye on yourself, right? Because these guys know how to come after you personally and then transit that into your business.
It comes in. That's one of the things is, with today out here, we're quick to, it's easy behind a screen to type your thoughts and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And lots of times I always say, type it, set it down, come back, pick it up, read it, and say, oh, should I send that?
Yeah.
Because 9 times out of 10, especially if emotions involved, you're going to read it and going, boy, that's dumb, and delete it, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
how we communicate, it goes into community coming in there, and don't be sucked into some of those things. It's just a conversation. That's what I hate about social media. It drives me nuts
Yep. Yep.
because there's conversations that you can have, but why do you want to get into a conversation with someone you don't know, that there's no way of true conversation and compromise conversations that you would have to come to? Don't mean you have to agree, but have a civil discourse and have conversations. But it does bring targets in more ways than one. So
Yeah.
you got to be
Yeah.
conscious of what you're doing out there, business wise. Personally, me as a business owner, I pay attention to that all the time.
Yeah.
Because one, I
Yeah.
have to, because I've got more than myself to protect. I got my employees
That's
I got to
right.
protect, but I got my
That's right.
clients I got to protect. because
Absolutely.
if they come after me, now I'm putting everybody else at risk. So you have to think about not just yourself, but who's the network of folks that could be impacted in coming in.
Yeah. Yeah, I live by I use the expression, know what's right, know what matters, and know what's yours, you know?
Yeah, that's
And it's that kind of like, yeah, take that step back and think about it. Because as you say, deciding to rant about somebody's comment in a social media posting because you don't like it, or a sports team or an outcome of a football game, whatever it is, and suddenly, again, that draws ill attention for that. I don't know, let's call it 5 seconds of some kind of dopamine satisfaction you get from, being clever, is not worth the pain and suffering that potentially comes. It's just, there's just no point, right? It's like,
yeah,
the best way to not to step on a landmine is don't walk into a minefield, right?
yeah, exactly. Don't invite disaster. The
Yeah, yeah,
as
exactly.
we talk through this in our landscape, and we coming up, we got 15 minutes left, but um, the big thing when I think about landscape, and I want to educate companies on is, I have customers that, the one or two person, they said, "Hey, I'm small. Why they're not interested in me? It's not enough money here." And
Hmm.
there's a lot of misconceptions about when it comes to cybersecurity about, you know, my business or my size or, how long I've been in business. There's a whole lot of misconceptions that when you come in here, and there's a lot of attacks that happen where
Hmm.
I call it the reverse pyramid effect, right?
Yeah.
Is I want the big guys, they spend tons of money, tons of money on cybersecurity, right? So they know that's going to be a little bit harder approach. So to me, you're going to go just like water. I'm going to follow the path of least restriction,
Yep.
right? So I'm
Yeah.
going to go after the small guy. I get in there, they have a database of their clients. Get into those, I get a database of their clients. And so I continue to expand because now I'm coming back through that trusted network. Because if I can ever get entry point in that trusted network, that makes it easier for me to get to the big guys where the big money's at.
Hmm.
And so
Yep.
that's the reason why I always tell them you got to be conscious. No, I don't care how small you are. One person company that's making 100,000 a year, you're just as much of a target as anybody else.
Oh
Go
yeah,
ahead.
and I've worked for a lot of big companies, but I can tell you it's the small ones that bear the brunt of this, right? It's the,
Yes.
community healthcare, small manufacturers, business firms, law firms, accounting firms, financial institutions. It's not just banks, the old Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? Well, it's because that's where the money is. Everybody's got money, and it may not be in the form of cash. It can be in something that's traded, right? Your PII, like you talked about, protected
Right.
information or confidential information. Lots of things you're worth going after, and they know you, like you said, right? You are not going to be as hardened as those big companies. And I think the other parts of this is just making sure you recognize, like that's the first thing I say to people. You have to understand you are a target. It doesn't matter where you are, how big you
Absolutely.
are, type of business. Because until you recognize that, you're never going to invest in doing anything to protect yourself.
So, it's like I love these misconceptions and these realities because it's funny. We hear them every day. Like we're saying, the big banks. Now, the small guys are there because it's easier to get in. Phishing
Hmm.
emails are obviously fake. Well, we all know since 90% of all attacks are coming to phishing email, it's not all where we find the problem. And even the FBI talks about it is on their website, which you can easily go see. Just go into the FBI main
Yeah.
website and go look at cyber, and it'll tell you right there.
Yeah.
The reason why 90% of the phishing attacks is where it starts at is because of education and
Yeah.
ongoing education. So, you know, clients we work with is like, okay, you don't want to doing the phishing training, cyber training for your employees once a year. That's something that needs to be going on all the time because the tactics are changing. So I know our training, every time something happens, they find that the training's updated to simulate that. So
That's right.
educate on it and simulate it because it's like the old saying from the coach is practice makes perfect. You're going to play the way you practice. So if you don't
Yeah.
practice, you're not going to play good. And it's the same way sitting here. So one of the biggest areas of attack, it's all about education and having that set up in your environment to make sure that's moving forward. And then I love this. There were no signs prior to the attack. No one can stop a nation state. Um, reason why that really hits home is one of our clients. It actually is one of our mutual clients. Um, we had our sim in there, and we got it setting up, and the customer was sitting there, and we're looking at it, and our team goes back, says, they called me and says, hey, we need to get all the customers. There's there's an there's an attack going on, and I don't think they
Hmm.
realize, you know,
Yeah.
and
Oh yeah.
because we had set appropriate cybersecurity stack in place with doing this, we saw when they were coming in, but no other system alarms, no other things were going off.
Yeah.
So there's signs. You just got to make sure you got the technology that allows you to see those signs when it's happening, so you can capture them before anything happens. Of course, we caught them, shut them off, and got them out of there, and figured out where the patch issue was. The customer hadn't patched their VMware,
Yep.
fixed the patch, went on about our business, right? But if it hadn't been there, that financial institution would have been in a very hurting state. So to say they're not, was it's 180 to 225 days, I think it is. They sit
Hmm.
dormant before they do anything, unless you're
Yep.
catching them as they're coming in. So yeah, there's signs. You just got to have the right technology to be able to see a sign. The human's not going to sit. A human sitting there watching the systems is not going to see it. You're not going to see it. I don't care how good you are. It's not going to happen. You're going to have AI and technology to
Yep.
help you figure that out. And then
Yep.
the cyber insurance coverage and backups. Well, the biggest thing and what we've been educating, matter of fact, our last webinar series was about cybersecurity insurance. We talked in depth about it. And, you really need what we're finding with our customers and looking at it, say, oh, I got a policy. Hey, great. Okay, we go look at it and say, okay, we'll do a free audit. We look at it and say, okay, in your policy, it has these requirements. Do you have those deployed?
Hmm.
No. Then the
Yeah.
policy is not going to pay out. I don't care what you do,
That's
you're
right.
not meeting the requirements. So understand, so another one of those, understanding your landscape. That cybersecurity insurance policy is part of your landscape coming into this. So it's really interesting when you talk to folks out there, their perceptions, and it's just education.
It is education, and I think, getting frankly, it's gotta go to the top, right? It's like I said, it's
Mhm.
that CEO understanding, that there's a risk, and in fact, talk a little bit about that of, proprietary or proprietor-owned businesses, they can kind of, they have a lot more flexibility and freedom to do what they want, versus, a larger, let's say, IPO public company where, obviously there's a whole lot of restrictions and regulations that they have to abide to and all that kind of stuff. And so convincing him this and then getting them out of that mindset of like, well, we have insurance and backups. And I'm like, yeah, well, you have seatbelts, airbags, and, auto insurance. Would you be willingly getting a serious car accident? Like,
Right.
no, of course you wouldn't. Right.
Exactly.
Because that's not what they're for. Right. They are I wouldn't even call it a parachute. Right. It's not even a parachute. And it's about making you whole again after you've had a significant loss. And I think that's where you got to recognize it's not that easy. And I know you've talked about this. So I don't want to belabor it, but like cyber insurance, it's getting harder to get. It's getting more expensive. The coverage is reducing. Premiums going up. Um, I think it needs to be part of your mix, but at the same time, right? There's they're fed up of paying ransoms too. So they're not if your go to is well, we'll just pay the ransom, yeah, that doesn't wash anymore. And
Nope.
and when you make a claim, when they're coming in and they're doing an investigation and they're looking at this stuff, it isn't for you. They're making sure, as you said, Wayne, you did what you claimed you were going to do. You said you have training, where are the records? You say you use two-factor authentication. Show us the logs, that kind of stuff. That's what
Yep.
they want to see to know that it's called duty of defense. Did you meet your
Yep.
duty of defense? Because if you didn't, tough luck.
Yep. So we've gone through this and we talk all different things, and in coming up, we kind of lay out in the devil's in the details. And really, what this slide is talking about is we're going to get into this in our requirements in our next webinar next Thursday, same time, same place. And so, what this is talking about is your disruption. This is from the time that something happened till you get it back up. And the reason why we're looking at that is kind of like, we want to deal with, okay, here's what happens after it and make sure you understand it, but relate this back to requirements. What are the requirements that we have to have in place to have the stuff in there
Mhm.
that lets us get back to resumption. That's really what we got to look at and what we're doing. And so if you understand this, and this process here is called an incident response plan, and it's got pieces into it. But when you start digging into, if I got my payment system, what are those systems?
Yeah.
What are the requirements to protect those systems? So we use this, and we're going to drive backwards into it, and we're going to talk about how you get into the various requirements that you're going to need for the business. So whether it's this off of this webinar or any of the next ones, both Mark and I have authored books, and we're offering these books to anyone that actually books a discovery call with us. You can do that actually in your screen. You come up and, there's a button to where you can actually book a discovery call. We have a call, and both Mark and I, we're going to autograph our books and send them to you. And hopefully what you'll do is come into the next one. Now we've talked about this. We're really going to dig into requirements, true requirements for a business. What are the things you need to be looking at from a cybersecurity standpoint to start developing out what that framework looks like to protect your landscape? And then we'll follow up with that, exactly how we go about doing that with the technologies we bring to bear in the third one, which will be the following week on the same Thursday. So I hope y'all have enjoyed it. Mark, I've enjoyed this. I'm looking for the next one because it gets better on the next one. We get to dig into the
Me,
meat.
me too, right? Yeah, we did the scary bit now, and now we start to get into, okay, so what are we going to do about it? And I think that's where it really gets important, right? So I'm looking forward to next week.
I know you and I both called each other a couple times through this, trying not to go down the rabbit hole because it's so easy to get
Yeah,
into it because we do it
absolutely.
every day. But while we still have some time left, if anybody's got any questions, go ahead and pop them into the chat and we'll address them. And we'll go from that. And I know that Mark and I are at a lot of different events. I know there's some other places, podcasts that we do and stuff like that. So
Hmm.
you can find us both out there. And also, if you just got questions for us, just let us know. You can do that through the system here and or connect with the connect button to set up a call, and we'll address anything we
Yeah.
can, even if it's just a conversation about what we covered, or if free assessment to come in and see where you stand to give you an idea of your current posture for what you're doing. We do that for you, and then see it going there. No obligations to it. So our goal here is to really help our client base and the customer base out there about all the problems with cyber and the landscape, how it's changing, and what you can do to protect yourself.
Yeah, and like Wayne said, we're always happy to come in. You need an executive briefing. You're on the technical side, and you need to get your CEO and your CFO to understand the problem. We're here to help. Right? We'll come in. We can tell these stories. We can give them that kind of broader view that says you're not the only one. Here's how you look like your peers, and where you stand compared to them, and your resilience, and what we think is happening, and what these laws changing mean for you, and so on, right? Because it's hard, right? And I realize nobody has infinite resources. You got a lot of stuff you got to do in the day, and it's hard keeping up with these things. So that's our job. So we're always happy to support you in any way we can.
Well, either we did a really, really good job, or they're saving them for the next one.
Exactly, exactly. Nailed it.
Well, Mark, with that, man, I appreciate it. I will see you next week, same time,
Yeah.
same place. And for everyone, have a safe weekend. Hope you enjoy it. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.